Welcome to season 3, episode 1 of the Database podcast. We have some big news to share for this season debut. INsite has merged with Education and Analytics. So now we're back home with Rosh. And we'll be continuing the podcast from our new home at EA. So I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, and I'm now a research scientist for interoperability at EA.
And I'm Rosh Dhanawade, and I'm the Director of Cloud Engineering and Interoperability at EA. And I've been in this role for a couple of years now, and super excited that the family is back together. It was always a little bit complicated because you're always working through an intermediary, but this is great. And we're super happy, and we're excited to see what the future holds for all of our teams together.
Yeah. So, same intro that you've heard before about EdFi and research, but for old time's sake, I'll read it again. So EA and INsite work with states and school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard. Through this work, we've come to realize that there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people working in this space: the language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, including data science and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among these 3 general areas because the more we understand how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make toward solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work. So today we're going to be doing a little retrospective on the podcast history, where we have come from and where we might be going in this season.
Yeah, so as much as has changed in where we all are at over the last couple of years, I feel like we're still talking about most of the same topics as we always have. So while our chosen technologies have moved forward a lot, it seems like the people that we all work with and the systems that we all work within haven't quite moved at the same pace as the technology is moving, which I think has been an evergreen problem, but that's a recurring theme in our previous seasons, and I think still persists today. I don't think huge challenges have been solved yet.
Right, and some of those have to do with people challenges as opposed to technology challenges. But I think the capacity that EA has for their partner strategy team is, just far beyond what we ever had at INsite. So it's exciting to think about what changes are going to come with that team in the future. And of course, Jamie O'Toole is leading that team, she used to be at the Dell Foundation and led the EdFi work for a long time. So very high expertise person in that role. Very excited to see the future of that.
And it's weird because when we started this work 7 years ago, there weren't a lot of peers that existed that we could just go and talk to directly. But one of the fun things about working at EA has been seeing all those people coalesce, and we're kind of attracting all those people that are building this almost semi-specialized skill set of being able to talk all these languages, and they're all coalescing here. And so every month that goes by, the conversations that we used to just have amongst ourselves, we now have a much wider set of people with also their unique backgrounds that come into play as well. And so you have folks that worked in a state agency and then bring that knowledge. You have people that work for a for-profit entity and bring that knowledge in. And so the array of people that are in this space are much wider than they used to be, which is a step forward in addressing the people complications. Mm-hmm. But it still feels like we have a big challenge ahead of us, even though we're getting these people in. But the sparks of like seeing that community of practice grow has been encouraging to me, because for a long time it felt like we were all in our islands in all different places. And while we were all tackling similar challenges, there were not a ton of venues to meet together and talk together. Like some of our other areas in data science have big gatherings, they have large online communities. And we still seem like a nascent community, but seeing that grow over the past 2 years has been fun.
Oh, I think that part of the reason that it is still so nascent is because of these multiple players in this space. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, you look at like the R Studio community or, you know, any other tech community, and people are incredibly active getting their questions answered, you know, but at least one third of this community is education practitioners. And that's not, you know, they are for the most part in the classroom, in the building, dealing with on the ground stuff. Questions are not immediately submitted to someone in the cloud, right? So even in the EdFi community, you know, we have the EdFi Slack channel. Everyone can join it, but I think you mainly see tech folks using that as opposed to educators. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting thought about the movement of different sectors at different kind of speeds or with different barriers involved.
And much of that is also culture kind of catching up. So I just was in a hallway conversation where we have a place where we spent several years investing into the infrastructure in that location. And now the people that are within the systems that are part of that infrastructure are having to build a new culture around data. Before they were just used to, I just do my normal work and the data gets parsed and decided upon by this external entity. Well, now some of the agency around that data is being passed to a group that used to yield that. How do you help somebody make that transition without it seeming like, oh, we've just given you a bunch of extra work to do? So while it is extra work, it's also a greater degree of say in what happens with your data and the decisions that are made downstream. In the past, you were sacrificing level of effort and level of work for a lack of agency. And now when you're flipping that, it's a hard conversation to even build a training protocol around. Like, how do you get people to do the things that they need to do and be invested in that when the incentive structure hasn't really changed? The end incentive is the same, is funding for your school, but the process to get there has shifted responsibilities, and training that, I feel like, is a untapped area of research and also of just practice. Like, how do you get people that are normally technologists that are just used to install a technology, hand the reins over to whoever, and then leave or be there for support? Now we also have to get people used to, now what do you do with this? We've empowered you. Now you have something to do with it. Oh,
They may not be the ones that want to do anything with it. Yeah. Um, I was just thinking about like the types of personalities who might have those positions, let's say in a district, like, you know, certain kinds of people like to be in tech roles, like to be the database admin or the help desk, you know, like personality. Obviously not 100% predictive, but once you have a different kind of tech where there are more decisions to be made ongoing, it's not always just implement this technology and my job is done. We've seen people in technology roles really evolve over their implementation of AdFi. I mean, like Laura, who is now at INsite and EA, was in a district tech role and learned so much about how this all works together and now is able to, you know, apply it beyond that role. It's helping other people do it. So I think we might start to see different kind of people types in those roles at districts as interoperability hopefully becomes more of the norm.
and one thing, even when there's a difference in person type or personality or whatever it is, it feels like the people that gravitate towards these roles have like the ability to see things wide and to see the connections between their organization's business units. And that's one thing that I have started to see happen in the field wherever EdFi or another interoperability standard is propagating, is that these people are ahead of the curve because they have already always been seeing the connections, even if they're not they don't have a decision-making role or they don't have a formal role, because they're at the nexus of so many data streams, they can see a bigger picture. And then sometimes it's frustrating for them why other people can't see the connections between the decisions that then impact people downstream, and like, why do we have to
Other
go
people are
yeah,
siloed still.
exactly. So
Right.
there's these people at the nexus of data that are unsiloed, but they're having to coordinate people that prefer to stay within their silo. A good example of this has been in Texas recently, where you have people that are in the HR finance are usually walled off from technology, and that's practically probably a good thing, because you don't want lots of people looking at finance and HR data and having their hands in that. And that's a totally fine separation for business purpose. But when it comes to reporting that data to the state, now there's a requirement for a new technology pipeline out of that HR finance. And now those HR finance people are normally used to staying in a silo, have to engage, and that engagement is now forcing other people to come in and have this broader view to say, oh, if we change a first name here and we don't inform this people here, it's going to cause problems over here. And that level of like getting people engaged is, again, an increase in the net amount of work. But hopefully, we as people that have been doing this for a longer time can promote the long-term cost and time savings, because if they coordinate now, it's a potential to reduce the amount of work in the future, whereas it's really hard to see that at this point in time. So
And that change also makes me think of the folks who organized the Indiana EdFi Data Conference. So that just happened in June, and it was organized by basically data coordinators and state reporters in various districts throughout Indiana. I mean, it was organized by district people, which is huge because the state has really been leading um, the state implementation of EdFi, obviously, and then INsite has been involved with the district level implementations. But now that every district in the state uses EdFi for state reporting, you have a lot more interest in it, and people in these roles, some people, a lot of people left. A lot of people left their roles during that by implementation in Indiana. But the ones who are still in it are, I think for the most part, excited to engage more about what it can do. Can it solve some of their current remaining pain points? There's a big interest in, can I get my data back? What can I do with the data I've sent to the state? So they're asking great questions. And the future is unseen as to where that will go in Indiana, but I think organizing a conference to bring people together and talk about it is just huge. And I wasn't able to attend, but I know you did. And
yeah, and what surprised me too is that there were a lot of this is the first year that I did state reporting types of people there. And that seems like a really great opportunity to start from the ground level for these folks that are just entering this role. What's the right type of layering of training, peer connectivity? And I think that was probably, to me, the most beneficial part of that conference, was saying to these new folks that are entering in that may have felt like they were on an island, hey, you have lots of peers to connect with. And the types of questions you have are probably the questions they have or have answered, or they're in the process of answering, and you have a connection. You don't have to be on your own. And another side effect of that is, hey, it doesn't matter that you have Power School or you have Skyward or whatever. It's, hey, we're all trying to solve the same problem. We're trying to get in the same destination, and we kind of have the same problem. We may have different paths to get there, but we're trying to answer the same problem. And that seems like a step forward from what it used to be, which is, oh, I'm just in my silo creating my exports by myself. And that seemed to be a lot of people. I could hear them as they were in lunch or walking in the hallway saying like, oh, I didn't know that like you were also in the same situation. We had a couple of sessions that they had facilitated. Hey, give us your pain points. And as people were giving their pain points, there were so many times that they said like, "Oh yeah, we have that same thing," but they're totally two different districts of different sizes, different vendors, but they're working on the same core problem. And those opportunities feel like a great step forward.
Yeah, and it seems like way more efficient to bring those common problems together, work on them together instead of having them be, 20 separate tickets or at the state.
Absolutely.
Um, so yeah, it's exciting to think about where Indiana's going to be in the next couple of years. We'll probably interview. Actually, it would be great to interview. I think it was Stacy Cunningham who put together that conference with some other people. Be really great to interview them. Still want to interview Ben Motes.
Yeah.
Who is working on a research infrastructure project funded by NSF at IU. We've been in contact with Ben for a long time, but I've never gotten him on the mic yet. And are there any other folks that you are hoping
there's a
to
lot of
interview?
new types of vendors that are entering the edfi space, and I'm curious to see from their perspective, because they're not an SIS vendor that has a huge amount of, but they're dealing with very focused amounts of data. What has their journey been like to say, oh, okay, we're throwing in with this data standard and we are doing it sometimes for compliance, sometimes not, but those kind of new entrants into the technology realm, to see if their experience getting up to date with edfi has been as tall of a hill to climb as the SIS vendors, and then if it has or hasn't, what their thoughts are currently.
Yeah, that would be great to talk about. Just that there may be other vendors out there who are considering. I'm thinking of iStation just
Oh right,
just
yeah,
did
absolutely.
their integration over the last year. It seemed to go pretty
Mm-hmm.
easy, pretty smoothly for them. Let's say not easy, but and then of course there's iReady's had one for a long time. Um, yeah, there's definitely a few vendors who we really like to see buy into edfi and get that API. And there's an interesting aspect of market pressure here, right?
Right.
If your state starts including edfi in RFPs, or districts start including edfi in RFPs, then not having that integration is going to become a liability.
Right. Yeah, and as more data has come through these pipelines, people on the state side, I think, are exploring more opportunities for what to do with that data. I mean, Indiana is one example. I think South Carolina is another example. There is some opportunities to do things with the data, and it'd be interesting to talk with those state leaders as well to see, is this fueled by things that they always had in their backlog that they wanted to do? Or has this adoption of new technology opened up new doors? And is it just the speed, the width of data? What is it that has prompted them to invest in dashboards for districts or a backpack or whatever kind of new thing that's a state provided technology? Seems like a nice contribution back to districts for their level of effort.
Mhm.
So it seems like they're asking districts to put more effort in. Well, can we give them something back in kind that represents a significant contribution back to their level of effort?
Right. Yeah. And, some of the things that we're going to be talking about with later interviews on this episode, or maybe part two of this episode, I'm not sure how it's going to work out. But, I talking to Andrew about the use of these data for research, and kind of we're at a threshold of just being able to do a lot of cool stuff with that. So we'll probably be talking with more researchers there, and hopefully people who are doing research in school districts, right? Not just external researchers, but people who are on the ground and can make an impact in their own space.
Yeah, and maybe to put more pressure on Ben, but the work that he's done with the Unison folks on the higher ed side mirrors a lot of the work that we do on our modern data stack adoption at EA. And it seems like if you have two sides within education adopting the same approach to parsing data and processing data, that would be great to get their thoughts on what their challenges are in higher ed, which are significantly different than K-12 education, but if you have the same technology, does it actually surface similar issues on both sides, or are they always and forever two different parties with different kinds of problems?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, this would be a great opportunity for, if our listeners have someone in mind or a topic that they're interested in having us explore. Um, please feel free to reach out. We'll include our email addresses in the show notes. And, I think this is a good opportunity for the podcast to kind of check in with the audience. And are we covering the right things? Do we want to do some updates on where people are, or do we want to kind of go in a different direction? We've talked about getting some of the SAS vectors on, and I still think that's really important because they play such a pivotal role in EdFi. If they don't play ball, there is no EdFi. So the SAS community, we definitely are overdue to have them on, but
there's also a wide range of topics that we may not even be exposed to on a regular basis, but are present in education. And so if you've listened to previous episodes, we've covered a wide range of topics. Even had like a live podcast that focused on data justice. And I think those are the kinds of topics that are emergent. And as this work continues to evolve, will expose in more acute detail than we're used to seeing, because if you're handling the bulk of moving data and you're automating that, or you're providing more enhanced pipelines for it, well, now it exposes maybe deep-seated structural issues that are in place that previously were papered over by the amount of work people were doing
to clean the data.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the kinds of topics that if you're seeing emerge, please bring it to the forefront, because that conversation probably is not happening in many places. So don't feel like a topic that we haven't covered before is not something that's on our radar. It probably just isn't on our radar. So please bring it up.
And I think also, with the Texas and South Carolina implementations, you have, the state funding the statewide state reporting implementation, but you also have one ODS per district, districts having access to their own data in ways that is not the case in other state implementations. So how does that look? Are they getting buy-in from districts? Are districts using it? Are the tools that are being made available actually getting traction? What are the lessons learned from a multi-level implementation? Because I think we probably both agree that that's the way of the future for various reasons. So yeah, we'll definitely have to think about who to bring in for those topics. But yeah, I think we're excited about where we're going next, and we're all here at the Education Analytics office this week. It's our biannual in-person staff gathering, so a lot of opportunities to spitball ideas and brainstorm and do podcasts on video, much to the chagrin of the hosts.
Because it's draining, because most of us, the INsite team, work remotely for the better part of the last 5 years. And I think whenever we had these office get-togethers or we go to a conference, I'm just acutely aware of how draining it is to be with other people. And so it's not about the people at all. It's just, I think, relearning how to be a social person again after several years of just, I'm in my office and I interact with people just through the screen, which is very convenient if you like to just be by yourself for a little bit.
Yeah. Right. So in this segment, we're back with Andrew Rice, CEO of Ed Analytics, who was our third podcast interviewee back in 2021. So it's exciting to revisit where things have been progressing since that. And today, what we're really going to focus on is the role of research with EdFi. EA is doing some movement in the research space related to using EdFi data, which is very exciting. And Andrew, I would say you've been propelling a lot of that. Trying to, yes. So, yeah. So, well, let's actually start with kind of a retrospective. So, what has changed regarding the intersection of interoperability and research since we talked in 2021?
I think in 2021, I'd be curious for you to answer the same question. We've got to think about we're in the middle of the pandemic. EdFi at the time and other kinds of technologies felt maturing, but now 4 years later, it feels like it wasn't nearly mature back then. And so it's almost like an in the moment kind of versus where we are now. And I kind of wonder, maybe if we do this in 3 years, like, well, what will we think then? Because now what I think we know is that we've proven, many organizations, many school districts, state organizations have proven that this kind of strategy can scale. And so, we've been trying to amplify the research use case of interoperability for a long time and continually running into roadblocks. And I think we're just now on the precipice where, because we have scale around the country in this technology, that we can actually do something. And now we could do stuff before, but now it's like we can do something really at scale. And now it's just a question of like, well, what is it? Mm-hmm. And how do we show it? And I don't know. I think there's a lot there.
Well, and thinking back to EA's technical development since 2021, EDU was developed since then, right? Because around that time, I think we went for a research grant to develop some of these things. Didn't get it, but you guys developed it anyway. So, I mean, that's just a huge step forward in progress alone. Being able to, I was just meeting with the research team and kind of describing to them the process of transforming the data via EDU from the core EdFi formats and making it much more user-friendly to a non-database admin. And that was just a dream, right? 2021.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge accomplishment and sets the stage for a lot of research projects over the next few years.
I think it does. I think our big challenge going forward is going to be, how do we scale that? So as EdFi scales out, how do we scale out the data science or research infrastructure on top of it? And I think we're making some headway there, but I do think it's going to require us to show what you're feeling, right? Like if you're deep in the EdFi world and you're deep in the research world like you've been, you can kind of see it. But if I go talk to a researcher at Harvard or Stanford or something like this, they are going to not understand that value until we're like, here it is. And then I think they'll be shocked at what's available.
Right. Yeah. And, being here for summer week and getting to talk to the research team a little bit more. I just came from lunch with them. So it just describing what EdFi is and what it can do and how I interact with it, it seemed very real to them as opposed to hearing like a data engineer talk about it. Mm-hmm. And so, we're going to meet tomorrow about let's look at what we have here. Instead of it being this kind of nebulous, unrecognizable thing. I don't think that's going to be the case for them. So that's very exciting. I feel like they don't realize how close they are to being able to do incredibly impactful research with this data.
Yeah, well, I think that just in general, the whole field doesn't fully get that yet. I do think, I mean, I don't know what the timeline you think is, but like, I do think in the next year or so, it will hit like no, it's gonna be,
In the larger field?
yeah, I think it'll just become like, oh man, more and more people will know. I think right now, I've had this conversation with folks of like, what could you do if you had access to, with permission from the school system, like access to real-time transactional data, and it's just so far away from the reality of a researcher that they don't even consider it. But I want to make sure that we talk about it. We can talk about it a little later. Is like, yeah, for researchers this is true, but we also have researchers inside school systems who regularly run into the same bottlenecks, even though they don't have they're not external. They regularly run into the same bottlenecks that our researchers do or academic researchers do. And I think it's really valuable for them as well.
Mm-hmm. Bottlenecks in terms of
your standard. I don't mean standard in a negative, like
your typical
your typical policy researcher that's trained in policy analysis inside a school system that's advising a superintendent or is advising a chief academic officer. They don't have database administrator skills either.
Right.
And so like the ability to just get all that data together and do something with it has not been their reality either.
Right. And something that came up in our meeting right before this was the ability of the researcher to access the data directly instead of telling an administrator what they want and not fully understanding the design of the data and the database and then getting something back that isn't exactly what they wanted, that like translation.
Right.
We're going to be skipping that step. I mean, there is still a lot of translation to be done in terms of, do you want a data point that isn't currently included in EDU or whatever, but for the bulk of the data points that we think people are going to look at, they're going to be able to see them directly, and with our studio connection, analyze them directly, which is just awesome.
Yeah. And the one thing that for our listeners out there, it's that raises an interesting privacy and security question, which is like, okay, now that any researcher can say, I want these kinds of data, and they can get them in the same format in every district in the country, and they can directly access it once they do have that permission. How do you make sure you gave them the right permission?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that we as an organization are going to have to think about is advising folks on how do we enable that kind of work while at the same time giving the protections that are needed for the data that they have.
Right.
But yes, the direct access. An example of this is probably 10 years ago, maybe a little less than 10 years ago, we were involved in a very large research project. And the goal was to get 20 plus, it was a lot, let's just call it 20 plus school districts to share data and do analysis on the effectiveness of teacher preparation programs. And that required us to get the same data across 20 different districts. And we had to develop a process by which we asked for the data, checked it, re-asked for the data, checked it again, and re-asked for the data. And it's not, the direct access isn't so much about the actual direct access of the system. It's I know exactly what I'm going to get when I ask for this.
Right.
And it's hard to overstate how important that is.
Often it's just being able to see, what does this column heading actually look like for the real data?
Right.
Maybe I actually needed this column, but until I saw data points, I didn't know. And I mean, you can usually see that even just with the data preview, should be enough.
Yeah.
I've
seen this with school districts too, that have a research department and who are working with their IT department, and they have to do the same thing that we have to do. Like, oh, I want this data.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I didn't actually want that data. Now that I see it, actually, I wanted this other data, and it's like it's the same thing. So if we can who knows how many cycles are being burned by researchers, policy analysts all over the country doing this.
Right.
It's gotta be ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a waste of the tech person's time too.
All sides.
There's no reason why they need
There's
to be.
no benefit to this.
Yeah. I think back in our research proposal from 2021, we were also proposing like some de-identification
Mhm.
section on the data warehouses, and your implementation of the standardization has so far just been in-house projects where, you know, everyone who has access to those has permission to have access to those, so the anonymization is not needed yet, but at some point it is going to be needed, and
Yeah.
that's that will be a technical question too. So
Very much so. And it's you know, we had a grant that helped us build some of that. So we have built some technologies that can allow for that, some strategies. I think the reality is, and there's like a whole field on this, like privacy budgets and like basically how do you protect data while still being able to research it. And it all relies heavily on having kind of a sophisticated technological backend behind it, and that's never been true in education. And so,
Right.
like, then you can't employ that, and then there's no point in this. But we are kind of in a situation now where the technology backend is sophisticated enough to handle that. And so then the question is, well, who's going to build it? We have folks that are interested in building it, but there's probably other people too. I would also say there's a very interesting and maybe it's a different topic, but there's an interesting policy problem here. I'll give you an example of what this looks like, which is that say you have multiple agencies of a government, like a State Department of Education, and then let's just say a legislature.
Health and Human Services. Oh, okay.
Like even above them.
Yeah, yeah.
And now we're dealing not with data sets, but with live data objects, data streams, as we sometimes call it. And if the data, if everyone's looking at the same data stream, but for one purpose, like say at the Department of Ed level, you're doing it for programmatic reasons, and you need to see stuff that the burden of data quality is lower in order to make certain kinds of operational decisions. But at a legislative layer, you're trying to make like big time funding decisions. How did you pass the data on from one perspective to another? And here I think this is where anonymization and privacy techniques are going to be important too, which is why you brought it up for me, is because the Department of Ed a lot of times has legal ability to see those data, and the legislature does not. And so how do you then have live data sets that are validated and connected at the same time? It's a very difficult technical problem, but it will matter for the future of the way we make policy.
Well, and there's a question, like the real-time question is, you know, does the legislature need to see data from 5 minutes ago, or is 2 weeks ago okay? Like the certification processes that states go through to make sure the data they're using for decisions are valid according to whatever business rules. So it seems like there are decision points that can be made for decision-making purposes, right? Versus operational purposes.
I would say not just can be made, but will have to be made
and
have never been made before. So it's like a bleeding edge of the policy space. And then on the, they will a lot of times have researchers who they're either contracting with or in-house. And then they have the same issues that all the other research use cases have as well.
The cool thing about doing implementations for EdFi, though, too, is it could expand the, like if you don't have an implementation using a data standard, you can limit the research access to certain things. To, a state can hire a certain researcher, it's going to be whatever they find, that's all you see. But with EdFi, I think there's a potential for more researchers to analyze the same data and compare results.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And here's where the economist in me comes out. There's lots of reasons for that, but to me, it boils down to just, I think, quantitative research where the data is administrative, i.e., stuff that we're already collecting. The cost of that kind of research is going to drop by 10x. And so you can do 5 times as many studies on the same thing and still save half as much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's valuable because you do want multiple perspectives on that. As researchers, we know different people have different methodologies, different things they're concerned about. So
or just replication studies. I mean, half of the research ideas that I have today are replicating what someone did 10 years ago, just to see if we got the same thing.
Right.
Especially if we have more granular data. Does that result still hold up? And if not, let's figure out why not. And that's valuable in and of itself, I think. It doesn't have to be a completely new idea.
Totally.
But let's make sure we were actually right on this.
Yeah. And I would say to jump off on that, there's so much research right now, quantitative research in the education research field or others, I guess, where you can start like that, verify that an older result is true, but maybe we don't know why it works or why something is happening. We just know that it is, and now we might be able to figure out.
Get in the black box.
Yeah. And I think there's just so much. I don't even know what the scope of that is. It's very large.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to say, what do you think will be possible within 5 years? But it sounds like you don't know.
Well, but it is that broader, like, I think imagine whatever you can imagine as a researcher when you have 10 times more granular data. And I guess, frankly, more frequent, more granular, more real time. The way I think about it is there's 2 major buckets. You can ask more detailed questions. And then that one's fun. I like that. But then the second one is when you answer the question, you can make the answer continuously answered. And what I mean by that is I don't just have to write a research paper. I can write some piece of code that sits inside the data system that continuously monitors the answer to that question in case it matters to do that from an operational perspective. And that's the part that really excites me.
Let's talk about what do you think is possible when we bring researchers to the table in our discussions about EdFi, thinking about EdFi from a researcher perspective. I mean, you and I are researchers, so we kind of know, but there's going to be non-technical researchers at the table too soon.
Yeah. I think my experience in this, and I know I met you early on in my experience with the EdFi community because I think we had similar experiences. So you can tell me if you think it's similar or not. But is that as a researcher or someone with a research mindset, I felt like when I first entered the EdFi community and to this day, the things that I cared about were not necessarily the things that the EdFi community cared about. And that's not a bad thing. That's just like, and by EdFi community, this is largely folks who are technologists, IT folks, those kind of people. And the things that they cared about were, I always kind of wonder, why are we spending so much energy on this? Now, I think I'm a little bit more nuanced on this. I don't think there's a ton of stuff where it's like we care about X in the community. And I think it's not the right thing. This is me learning and growing and saying, okay, well, there are certain things here that matter from a technology perspective. But I do still think like the, where you invest limited resources on standard setting and data collection around granularity matters because you can't do it all. And so like, if we care a lot about for instance, right now, we care a lot about teacher shortage in the education research space, right? If we care a lot about that, then maybe we should be spending a lot of our time in the technology and EdFi standards, data standards space, thinking about HR systems and student-teacher linkages and all that other kind of stuff, which some of which we do and some of which we don't. And
it's not being like can't think of the word now.
I would say it's not being focused by any sort of use case. Maybe that's, I don't know what you're
Yeah. I hate words. Intentional is the word are those decisions intentional about that kind of use case, or are they coincidental decisions that happen to be related to that use case?
Yeah, right. I think right now what we get to this day, because it's still largely technologists in the EdTech community. Again, this is not bad. It's just how it is that the intentionality will be for use cases that aren't necessarily research use cases. And so you might incidentally get, like you're talking about, get things like HR data or positions or things like this, but you won't drive that as fast as it could go if there were like strong need for that. And I think we can do that.
Yeah. Or you can figure out where those use cases dovetail together and present the case based on the more persuasive use case.
Right. I think as we collectively start to, it'll become obvious once we start to use data like this for research. It'll be like, oh, well, the next thing is this. We don't have those data. Oh, okay, let's work on that.
Yeah. So remember my other question. In terms of research methods, say that folks are using with data sets that are available to them now versus very, not just granular, but time granular. What kinds of methodology changes do you see coming down that people need to either expand into or brush up, on time series analyses, things like that, as opposed to looking at, 1 year of data that's 1 year time point.
Right. That's a very interesting, good question. I think that one could probably segment that into 3 different buckets. The first one is, are there technological things you need to do as a researcher? It's kind of logistics, like, can you actually access data at that kind of scale? Like, we're talking, multiple millions of data points coming in a day or something like this. That might be partnerships, or it might be skills learning or whatever, if you're a researcher, to figure that out. So that's one. That's a kind of an easy one. Not easy, but easy answer. Then there are probably a whole bunch of methodological issues where there's like a general known answer. And so I would claim that broadly what we're talking about is lots and lots of highly detailed panel data, which is like very wide but very highly frequent. And so unless you're interested in very narrow use cases, then time series won't be the biggest thing. It'll be this panel stuff. But the general panel kind of methodologies, I think, break when you get lots and lots of data. So then you get into, they don't break, but like you're going to have to modify them. And then we're going to need methodologists inside the education field to start to think about what methods are required for these sort of things. And they're not going to do these. And we have plenty of highly skilled methodologists in the field. But they're probably not thinking a lot about this. So then it's like, well, how do we get them to think about it? And then there is there's a bucket that's a whole bunch of, like, there's probably just new stuff. Machine learning kinds of algorithms, which are really, in this case, are really just going to be very advanced panel data kind of things. But I just think there's probably going to be a ton of space for the methodologists here who maybe haven't had the opportunity to think about what it means to have just massive data in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is something that I really appreciate about EA's interest in not just working with these data internally, but trying to advocate for using them more with the larger research field, bringing in those kinds of expertise if we don't have them in house, bringing in those people who would be really interested in that question, trying to get some examples of analysis of this data out into the field, whether, at conferences, at working papers, whatever.
Yeah. Well, if anyone's listening, we're always open to that. Yeah.
I've got a list of people that I'm going to reach out to.
Yeah. And again, I want to always say, in combination with that, the main thing that we're always concerned about is like, we do not give access to anyone's data ever.
Right.
But what we can do is think about methodologies, both technological and statistical, that work on all of these data when someone does give you permission to use the data. And yeah, the sky's the limit.
Yeah. Partnering on projects, if we don't have that skill set in-house, partnering with an external researcher in an official way, like, is a great opportunity there, but also just, the synthetic data sets that EA has been starting to put together, I think is a fantastic way to let people see what it could look like for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought too carefully about that, but what I've always hoped is that a researcher, say you're sitting in your university office and you are like, I hadn't heard about this EdFi thing before. I've got a partnership with a district, and you ask them, they say, hey, do you have EdFi? And they say yes, and then you go, well, what do I do? Right. Well, that then is a question of like, well, first of all, you need to learn the system. And so things like us having synthetic data for that sort of thing could be very valuable just to play around. Not that they could answer any questions, but yeah, absolutely.
But you could test your,
code.
Yeah. Would be a good way to get your feet wet, at least.
Yeah.
So.
Because it's likely I imagine a future where many of the districts are going to say, we're not going to let you have the data, but we will run code for you. And so you're going to have to be able to test it against something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other, for any researchers or evaluators who might be listening to this, is thinking about those current partnerships that you might have and considering an EdFi implementation as a supplement to those projects, where it's EdFi is just the enabling mechanism to get you what you need. And so I think when we talk about funding EdFi projects, looking at it from a research or evaluation perspective, we can kind of not just think about it as we're going to implement this for this district because they want to use the data in an actual actionable way, operational way, but rather this district has questions that we're going to answer for them. And the easiest, cheapest way for us to answer them is to get this standardized data set and implement the technology instead of spending 80% of your budget cleaning Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you can manage a strategy like that, then you can open up so many more things. But the other thing there is like, the easy path is always going to be ask for data, but you're long-term going to continue to have the problem over and over and over again. The harder path is, okay, work with them to implement this sort of thing. That means learning how to work with the research department and the IT department at the same time. In those cases, you may not have the patience for that. It's when you can reach out to folks like us or others who do this for a living and help out with stuff like that.
Yeah, there are definitely some tried and mostly true paths for navigating those things.
Yes.
And it has gotten so much easier in the past 3 years to implement EdFi, especially with a managed service provider like EA is, along with others.
Yeah, there's lots of others. Yeah.
It just takes away so much of the risk and the need for certain technical expertise at the district is, not a prerequisite anymore.
So a question for you, because I know you've worked heavily with districts on the research side of EdFi. What do you like if you were giving advice to a researcher outside of sort of our little circle of EdFi people? What do you think you'd give them from the perspective of like if you were going to open that conversation with a district, what would you say?
With the district or with a researcher?
With a district. So say a researcher is out there and like, oh, I think this is cool. I wonder how I do it.
Mm-hmm.
Does my partner district have it? Fine. Like, what would they say?
Sorry, what would I say to the district? I mean, one, it depends on the size of the district, right? But I think one of the things that you want to talk to them about is, how, like, what's the budget, right? How much were you going to have to spend if you do it this way versus this way? There's also the thinking towards the future aspect, which is we're not just talking about what we need for one specific research project today, but building an infrastructure that can allow you to not only work with other research questions, but also operational questions, and building that foundation that lets you do many things. Unfortunately, the way that school districts operate, it sometimes isn't that. There's turnover in leadership, there's budget issues, funding issues, so it can't always be that predictive for the future. But thinking about what are all the different use cases that could apply to this investment, and focusing on the quick wins, offering some visualizations, or getting that initial implementation paid for by a research project, I think is a great way to dovetail those things as well.
I think then there's like an even more surface thing to me, which is you can just ask, like, hey, do you have EdFi? Because they may already have it. It's interesting that because it's largely a technology project, sometimes even the research and policy folks inside a school system don't know that, and they will be like, "Oh, I don't know, I'll go ask."
Right.
And if they say yes, it could open up a whole slew of things. And at that point, like, they send us an email, we can talk about how one has that conversation.
And thinking about EA's projects in Texas and South Carolina, where you are having not only a state implementation, but also some local databases where people will actually be able to use their EdFi data for something beyond state reporting. That's so powerful. And I think over the next 2 years, we're probably going to hopefully see a lot of impactful things being done at the local levels, and maybe statewide, depending on the interests of funders and state departments. But setting up the infrastructure is the first piece. If you don't have that, you can't do any of the other things. So I think we're going in the right order, not the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
And now for me, being at EA and being able to kind of interface with some of those bigger projects, it's exciting. And just meeting the existing requirements analysis requirements of those projects using EdFi is very exciting. I know for the team here as well.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. I mean, this is the promise. Let's see if it happens. I think it's exciting.
You don't sound very optimistic, but I think it's going to work.
Everything takes longer than I want it to. So, like, if I think it should take a year, it's probably going to take 2. And if it's 2, it's 4.
Sure, but it will work.
It will work.
It's not going to not work.
I think we are there.
Yeah,
I think we are there, and I think I'm super excited about you joining our organization for that, for the stuff that you're going to be able to learn about us, but also help the current staff here, like, oh, this is how I'd better interface with this kind of researcher or that kind of researcher. Hopefully this can all get contributed back to the community so that the whole field wins. And we're quite excited, or I'm quite excited about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've pretty much covered most of the topics we were going to talk about. Do you want to add anything else? Any other talking points to the research community directly?
I mean, the only thing I just want to keep reiterating, like, if this sounds interesting and you're like, what in the world are they talking about? Just reach out. Like, we're so excited to have other folks sort of pressure test this theory that we could really push quantitative research and education to the next level. And maybe we're wrong, but we would like to be proven
or mixed
wrong.
Methods.
Yeah, all things.
There's so many great opportunities for quick feedback, data feedback in terms of quantitative stuff, but that could also inform qualitative interventions or, and those things, those kinds of research projects are just so much more resource intensive that it's, I don't think we're logistically thinking about doing those yet, but there's a lot of promise there, and there might be other researchers who have that interest, that could be partners on.
That's a great point. I mean, yeah. I mean, to the extent that it's always, if the bottleneck is like, hey, it'd be great if we had all these data so we could then do something. But the answer is always like, well, you're never going to have access to those. And, well, maybe you will. What does that mean?
Never hurts to ask.
Yeah. Give us a thought. Like, we'd love to know.
Yeah. And it will be very interesting to see how, research funders respond to proposals that include this kind of thing. And I think the first step is doing some analyses, pilot analyses, showing the value that you can then use to make your case for additional funding.
That's an important topic. Maybe we can take a couple minutes on that, because I think there is going to be, for a short period of time, a kind of disbelief in the funding community that this is possible, because the funding community has been wanting this sort of thing forever. And I'm sure it's been promised. No, I'm not sure. It's been promised before. But I think at this point it's real. And so I do think, we're going to need our funding partners and all philanthropy, government, et cetera, to basically say, oh, I'm willing to experiment with this, because this could actually answer the question or solve the problem that I've been asking for the last 15 years. But we are going to need those folks to think carefully about this rather than, and we've seen this both with proposals that we've submitted and others have submitted. We've seen immediate rejections from like, oh no, this is not possible. It's not a not good idea. It's not possible. It's like,
that's why you've got to have those pilot analyses to say, we've already done it.
Right.
We want to do it on a bigger scale or whatever the difference is. But we already have done it. Here are the results. Give us some funding to, exceed these current limits.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Yeah.
It's just going to be a short period of time where.
That's what I think too. That's what I think too. All right. Well, I think that's good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll talk again on the podcast in 3 years.
Yeah. We'll solve all the problems for everyone.
Perfect. I love it. All right. Thank you.